in terms of the historical struggle, I was looking the other day at the foreword in this copy of the Constitution by a scholar over at the Cato Institute, and I was struck by his underlining of something that Ken and I talk about all the time, and that is that there's been a historical struggle between those who believe in natural law and those who believe in positive law, and that higher law, natural law, trumps positive law. The president believes in the power of positive law. We, in fact, happen to be in this tug of war on the other side. We're pulling for the natural law forces and the transcendent values that should govern our deliberations and our shaping of positive law. And I think it's a battle. It's a historic battle. The other thing is where you're right, and it goes back to the question that was just posed to Ken. I mean, the fact is that Hoover sort of set the table for FDR. And George W. Bush, in his last year, and some would argue in a lot of his terms, set the table for this paragraph by Barack Obama. You know, so but I would argue that by scale, these things are not even in the same league. And as a consequence of those who were critical of the Bush move and who are critical of the Obama move, it is time for us to plant the flag, draw the line, take the stand, and win the game. That's what this book is about. It's a you know, call to arms. It is, you know, the football's in our hands now. Let's run with it and score. We, in fact, are in a historic struggle for the character of governance in our country. And if you believe in the balance of powers, the separations of power, if you believe that the individual is at the center of the political universe, not the state, then you will pick a jersey. You'll pick a team, and you'll fight the fight. And if you have $15 tonight, you can buy the book.
Which is a whole lot cheaper than a jacket price.
This is kind of a continuation of your point about making positive law. Sometimes back, the Weekly Standard did an article on America becoming a nudge-ocracy. Like the czars were nudging us to kind of do what they wanted us to do. Yes, exactly. Very much so about Cass Sunstein. Always worth about that. Do you have similar concerns? And what are your thoughts about how much is too much nudging on us?
Well, I'll start by saying we talked about Cass Sunstein in chapter 1 of the book. In that, which, as Ken said, if you have $15, you can find that out. We use our own terminology rather than others. We think that it's a pretty clear-cut equation. Government is established for certain reasons. It has certain powers permitted to it. And see, there's a huge difference. 1930s versus 1960s. 1930s, a liberal president comes to power. There was a moderate Republican, not a conservative Republican. My goodness, do not allow anyone to tell you, and we discussed this in chapter 3 or chapter 5 of the book. I think chapter 5. Don't let anyone tell you, Herbert Hoover, was a conservative Republican, and we saw in him the disaster of free markets, and thank goodness FDR came along and put a stop to all this corporate greed. Heck no. Herbert Hoover was a moderate. Calvin Coolidge was a conservative. And America had spectacular economic success under him. Then we got a moderate Republican, Herbert Hoover, who was hiking prices and implementing the most oppressive protectionist law ever, which Europe couldn't handle with still rebuilding from World War I, imports tanked, all sorts of stuff happened. You can read about it in the book in terms of the causes of worsening the Great Depression. But it then gave political cover to this president who came in with big government leftist policies. During the first few years of the Roosevelt presidency, the Supreme Court was mowing down huge parts of the New Deal. 1935 and 36 especially saw things struck down for violating the Commerce Clause, for violating the 10th Amendment, for violating what's called the non-delegation doctrine, and all of these other issues that were going on. Then in 1937, FDR got enough appointments on the Supreme Court, that and the fact that he was threatening to pack the Supreme Court with 6 brand new justices, expanding it from 9 to 15, that one of the justices on the court, 2 of them actually panicked. So FDR is appointing pro-New Deal justices, 2 more of them get scared, and all of a sudden it flips. And starting in 1937 in the Jones and Laughlin Steele case, everything FDR got, everything he did was just rubber stamped as constitutional. That was the fundamental derangement of the Commerce Clause jurisprudence in this country. Commerce Clause wasn't used to strike down anything after that day until 1995 in U.S. v. Lopez, and then in 2000 in U.S. v. Morrison. And I think that's instructive because the 1960s also saw a radical explosion of federal power. But in the 1960s, there was a staunchly liberal majority on the U.S. Supreme Court. So again, with LBJ's Great Society, as you got these monstrous expansions of federal power, once again, whatever he did, just rubber stamped as constitutional. And that's why we make the case that right here, right now, is where we need to be making the fight, while we still have courts that have not yet been remade by Barack Obama in his own image.
You have a room full of young professionals, young students that want to get active. If you were to offer a game plan to us to stop the Atlantic Kagan nomination to the Supreme Court, to stop the Goodwin-Lewis from advancing through the system and being positioned to take over the Supreme Court, what's your call to do? What's your call to action to us right now to say, hey, this is what I would do? Can we pick the Ken's brains to suggest some actions that we can take forward today and implement?
It would take you about 30 seconds and exhaust mine, and then you have his to work on. Look, I'm not sure what we can do to stop the Kagan nomination, except nothing succeeds like good information. Using modern day technology to spread the word on what I consider to be, one, her inexperience from the bench, and her inclination to affect public policy in a non-judicial manner. And so I would do that. She is a very bright political operative with very, very little bench experience. And I would suggest that if I look at her history, she will be a very, very good, bright political operative on the bench as an associate justice. So that's one. Second, pick a campaign. And in fact, make sure that at the Senate side, it's not 3 takeaway seats, but 9 or 10. That will be the big break. Again, elections have consequences, and we're playing out those consequences of 2008. And again, I will underscore, look, the problem is that since the great transformational election, change election of 1994, the problem in the latter part of the 90s and in 2001 through 2006, Republicans who had campaigned like Ronald Reagan started to govern like Jimmy Carter. And they paid the price for that. And so what you want is what Ken was saying, authentic believers in our constitutional Republican form of government that would put limits on government and begin to rein in government spending. Look, again, Republicans have been part of the problem in the past. The reality is that in the last 10 years, 10 years ago, our government spending was about 34.1% of GDP. As we speak to you this evening, it's about 40.5. There are some Republican fingerprints on it. What we need is to make sure that we're going out there getting candidates who get the joke, who understand where the Republican Party and its representatives went wrong, and who are really dedicated to being not elbow rubbers inside the Beltway, but real agents for constitutional government, once they get here representing the people outside of the Beltway.
We talked about judicial confirmations in Chapter 2. Now, one of the things to take away from Chapter 2 as we discussed that, though, is there has been a complete change in how that's been done. For 200 years, the standard for Senate confirmations was that so long as a nominee was deemed to have the right education, the right experience, and was considered a person of good character, meaning people of honor and integrity, not susceptible to bribes or being criminals or anything like that. So long as those three things were checked off, the president's nominee should be confirmed. And on that standard, there were nominations that went down, close to 20% is the historical number. That standard is why Antonin Scalia, who as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and before that as a law professor at the University of Chicago, who had tons of writings, he spoke a lot, everyone knew exactly where it was coming from, that he was a rock-ribbed conservative, was confirmed 98-0. And it's not because there were 98 Republicans and no Democrats in the U.S. Senate. It's because there were 2 senators gone that day, and everyone else said, yeah, well, this guy meets the qualifications. As we talk about in the book, the following year, 1987, was the Robert Bork nomination. Robert Bork, whom former Chief Justice Berger, who was by no means whatsoever a conservative, a real moderate, said that Bob Bork is probably the most qualified individual ever nominated to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court. Yet he was rejected. He was rejected for only one reason. He was conservative. And Democrats went apoplectic that this might be the 5th vote to undo Roe v. Wade, and Ted Kennedy gave his Robert Bork America speech where people have to sit, where racial minorities have to sit at segregated lunch counters and women die in the alleys from back alley abortions. And it was an unprecedented attack on a well-qualified nominee. And his nomination went down in defeat.
And he didn't return videotapes.
That forever changed the game. And then it was taken to another level once again when there was a Republican president, this time Bush 43, and a Democrat Senate. Once again, we saw that for the first time then extended to the circuit courts, where Miguel Estrada, one of the most qualified people to ever sit on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, was filibustered. Where Janice Rogers Brown was filibustered. After we retook the Senate, she got confirmed. But where where the obstructionism went beyond the Supreme Court to even the middle courts. And whoever the president put up, John Roberts, Sam Alito, doesn't matter. They try and destroy it. They try and filibuster. When we go through all that in the book as to exactly how things went, and there was actually real danger for the Alito nomination for a while. And we describe in the book how actually it was his wife who turned the tables and made the opposition collapse. So the bottom line is, what are we going to do now? Under the traditional standards of confirmation, Elena Kagan shouldn't necessarily have too much of a difficulty, although she does have a lack of experience, and that would be a real concern. But nonetheless, on balance, maybe it should be okay over the traditional criteria. But what are Republicans to do? Just unilaterally disarm? You know, we tried that when a Democrat became president again. We tried that in '92 after Bill Clinton got elected. He nominated Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had been general counsel for the ACLU. She had taken radical positions on abortion, on other social issues. Yet, we said, look, she was an editor of the Columbia Law Review, the first woman ever to become a tenured professor at Columbia Law. She was a distinguished judge on the D.C. Circuit. You know, what can we say? So Republicans voted to confirm her 96-3. The next year, Stephen Breyer, pretty much the same thing, confirmed 89-9. So we tried to take it back to the statesman-like standards of the past. But as I said, once roles were reversed, Republican president, Democrat Senate, all of a sudden, even though they're in a minority, they didn't have the Senate, they just had a minority. And they tried to destroy Roberts and Alito. So as we talk about in the book, we think the only solution is we need to get back to the constitutional norm, to understand and accept that elections have consequences, and that a president gets great latitude in who he nominates to the U.S. Supreme Court. But we're going to have to make this an awful, painful, and expensive and costly process for them to get them to cry uncle and come to the table so that both parties can agree after the next presidential election that whoever wins, we need to talk about standards that everyone will live by. But as long as that's the way they want to do it, then we need to give it back to them.
One more.
At our last authors night on last Monday, Lee Edwards talked about Wilbur Kendall, then professor. He was a scholar of John Locke, and he also argued that Congress was inherently more conservative than the presidency because the presidency took the majority of the people in the U.S., and that was his elected basis, whereas Congress has local representatives. Could you reflect on how this Congress might have the potential to be more conservative than Obama's radical actions towards the separation?
You want me to discuss whether Nancy Pelosi is more conservative than Barack Obama? I feel like I'm arguing degrees of infinity. One versus the other.
Institutionally, whether or not you feel that there can be that pullback against the Obama.
Whether the left hand can know what the further left hand is doing.
I think, and you can speak to it.
Go ahead.
But I think it's a matter of winking and nodding. I think institutionally, you might be right with these particular personalities that comprise the Congress and the executive branch. But I think Nancy Pelosi will in fact wink and nod to the use of executive regulations to achieve their shared ends of, government takeover of the energy sector of the economy through cap and tax. And so I think it's a legitimate question that you raise, but I think the team in power now, they wink and nod at each other. It is the shared end game desire that they have that's the problem. Because I think she'll give up some of that authority and some of that constitutional right that the Congress has to be able to get her folks elected, but also achieve what they share, and that is a more collectivist socialist state.
Yeah, Bethany, and I'm just giving you a hard time with how I started off. I think there's an argument to be made both ways from an institutional perspective as to which branch of government is inherently more to the left or right. But I really think it comes down to who are the human beings who occupy those offices. I can think of certain people in the Congress right now that if they were in leadership and had a majority, would be to the right of most Republican presidents I can envision. I can also think of a couple of people looking at presidential bids that if they were to win to the White House, may be more conservative than even a conservative Republican majority in Congress. So I really think it depends on who exactly we elect to fill those offices. And I think the moral of the story there is that that's where our focus needs to be. As we describe in the book, how to slam the brakes on Obama's blueprint right now, to staunch the bleeding, to stop the damage, and to hold things in check as we elect the right people to the House and the Senate and the White House and retake this country while we still can.